Hello and welcome to No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. An update on our neighbors to the south in the post 100 days of President Trump's second presidency. A trade truce with China and American hostages released, potential deals between Moscow and Kiev. Who knows? There are meetings on that. And the opposition, the Democrats, can't seem to land a punch on the president. So we're going to our friend, Clifford Young. He is the president of polling and societal trends at Ipsos in Washington. We've talked to him over the last couple of years about what is going on. I laughed, Cliff, when I was looking at your notes, your bio, and it said Young is considered an expert on polling in emerging markets as well as polling in adverse and hostile conditions. Some might describe the United States of America as that.
By the way,
How's
that
it going?
predates my stay in the United States, right?
I understand.
Yeah, but yeah, it is apropos. It is.
So what do you make of it all at this point? There is such conflicting, the chaos theory that chaos reigns, and there's no question it's busy. This guy works at, as they call it, Trump speed, 24/7. What do you think Americans are thinking about what they're witnessing?
Well, there's a lot of noise, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of friction in the system, and you can feel it, right? As Trump pushes forward an agenda that's thwarting convention, that's going against what people expect in terms of from a normative standpoint, and you definitely feel that today. It doesn't matter what indicator you're looking at; it kind
Right.
of it shows itself that way. Now, the question is, let's be more concrete. So. How are Americans feeling at this point? There's a lot of trepidation. There's a worry about inflation. They link tariffs with inflation.
Yeah.
Obviously, they've come off a pretty rough time with high prices, cost of living. Obviously, Trump won on those issues. And the expectation has been that he will relieve that pressure. And we're seeing actual behavior, not just people saying that they're worried. We're seeing anticipatory behavior already, where Americans are maybe buying a few more rolls of toilet paper,
Right.
or buying a washer or dryer in anticipation of a tariff. They might not
Pushing
be
the
going.
price up. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They might not go on that trip with the family for the summer. They might just, instead of flying, they might go by car somewhere. And we're seeing that, right? But nothing's happened yet.
Yeah.
And this is all in anticipation of, and I think we have to be careful with that, typically, normally, it's the economic variables that sink a president or sink any political executive
Yep.
anywhere in the world. And we're in a pretty good place with unemployment and inflation right now. So this is all sort of expectation, right? Now, that said, where does he stand, right? And the most important indicator, as we all know, is approval ratings. They predict who's going to win. They're predictive of like being able to get your agenda forward. They're all about legitimacy. And obviously he started off at sort of a lower point than the average, right? He starts off, depending on how you cut it and how you look at it, but if you take all the polls together, he's at 51 and the average is in the high 50s, historically speaking. We live in a very polarizing time. Trump is a very polarizing figure. So that's probably less fair, that sort of look, that he's lower than the average. The question is, has he declined faster than the average? And what we know is, on average, in the first 100 days, a president declines by about 3 points. Loses part of the coalition, starts making decisions. Okay. People
Yeah.
kind of start disagreeing with him. How much has Trump declined? He's declined by 6 points. And so he's twofold the average, 2 times the average. I wouldn't put too much stock in 2x, but it is, I think, correct to say he's faring worse than what typical presidents fare. And I'll just go back to my initial point. I think a lot of that is frictional.
Yeah.
And not just with tariffs, right? Because his signature issues, like a more efficient government and deporting illegals. People agree with those issues in principle for the most part, but they disagree with the method by which the
Yeah.
administration is going about implementing it. So lots of friction once again.
So, but again, what you seem to be saying here is there's a sense of chaos, but that's a lot coming from the reportage about it, and we see that. I listen to a lot of American news, and it's reporters kind of saying, "Oh my God, he did this deal, and then he had this meeting, and he's got six executive order signings, and then he's jumping on a plane to Saudi Arabia, and oh, and then he met with it." He's busy. He's doing stuff. He's got 4 years. He knows it's his last shot. He's going to get as much done as he can. Go along for the ride. He's there. Just take notes and report.
Yeah, but yeah, that's true. And you have a lot of, once again, noise,
Yeah.
with the chattering class, right?
Yeah.
But it's also with Americans in general. So we obviously do polling, quantitative polling, but we also do a lot of qualitative
Yeah.
research, focus groups and interviews. And, there is this sort of among just the average American, they're worried about inflation, right?
Right.
And they're uncertain about tariffs. And by the way, tariffs at this point is kind of a bad word. They don't like it.
Yeah.
For the
Yeah.
most part, they don't agree with it. They're not willing to take a little bit of pain to get a little bit of gain later. That's a Republican talking point, not a general talking point that
Yeah.
works with the American population. And so that's real. I think we have to understand that it's just not people doing, basically reeling at or holding their nose at sort of Trump's behavior. The average American this time, differently than let's say 2017, really is worried about whether this tariff thing is going to impact their lives.
So it overshadows all of the stuff that people elected him for. Reduce government, get the illegals out, deal with DEI, get boys out of girls' sports. Like all of those, everybody had their own trigger issues. So, but when it comes to the bottom line, to my purse, to my pocketbook, then everything else is off the table. I got to focus on this. I've got to focus on what this means.
Well, at the end of the day, if you can't make ends meet, it's a real issue, right?
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
we said, it hasn't happened yet,
Yeah.
or just on the margins, it's percolating, right? And so that's not to say that deportation of illegals, especially illegals who are criminals, that doesn't mean that sort of reducing the size of government isn't important to people. I think that plays to the base well.
Yeah.
And it even plays to sort of maybe not his core base, but the broader coalition that he was able to put together in 2024, bring in libertarians and that kind of libertarian strain. But like I said before, people question the methods by which the
Yeah.
administration is operationalizing it. They don't like people being spirited away in the middle of the night.
Right.
They don't like mass firings of individuals that have families, a mass firing from the government. They want some sort of fairness, whether that's due process or some other sort of way of kind of assessing in a regimented way, but they want this to be done in a fair way. But I once again chalk that off as to friction, and like in my mind, his greater decline than 3 points, his 6 point decline, is in part that, and the question is, can he gain it back if he steps off the pedal a bit? Does he gain those points back? I mean, that's a crystal ball kind of a moment for let's say someone like me, but I think probably there's a good likelihood. And what I would say is, and we were talking about this before the program, but like he has shown himself to be extremely savvy, right? And
Yeah.
so you could see once again him sort of like testing the boundaries of what was possible with tariffs.
Yeah.
And then he felt the pushback. He felt the constraints. He felt
So
that
all of a sudden there's got to be a deal with the UK or
yeah,
deal
or
with
we're
China,
going to
even though it
put a
might not be a
moratorium
deal.
on
Yeah.
the higher tariffs, or we're going to cut a deal with China. Indeed, our base case has been because of that very reason, because he's a political animal. He wants to get his agenda through without like destroying everything, himself included,
Right.
right? Because the number one thing that gets nailed if you go too far is your legitimacy. That is your approval ratings fall. That he's kind of stepped back, and what he's going to have is a much more modulated tariff agenda, a trade agenda. And I think it's interesting because it's not evolving exactly like I thought it was going to. I thought it would be exclusively China, everything else would fall by the
Yep.
wayside. It might be China light and everything else a little bit lighter. But it looks like he's there. And once again, I think he's a political animal and he's
Yep.
showing himself to be extremely savvy.
So what about those, I guess maybe people have just come to take it with a grain of salt. And I'll get into the Canada thing in a moment, but I'm going to solve all the world's wars. They never would have started if I'd been there, but on day one, I'm going to end the Russia-Ukraine battle. I'm going to, turn Gaza into the best set of hotels and casinos you've ever seen, right? Like, then reality clicks in. So are they reacting to that at all? Because he's on the one hand, he's doing a lot of what he said he was going to do, Doge and bring jobs back and focusing on that. On the other hand, with this inflation, my pocketbook, what it's costing me, how do people balance those? Do they just ignore the other stuff? Nobody really thought he was going to solve a war in one day, so why are we worried about it?
Yeah, I think that goes to his style. And I think that, especially, I think Americans in general, but I think especially those in his base accept him as being extremely irreverent.
Yeah,
And that's what he does. He like goes after the establishment way of doing things in every sense of the word, right? Including just bragging publicly about sort of ending all these wars in a millisecond. But that kind of reinforces his credibility. His base sees him as a champion for change. They're breaking a broken system to recreate it, to fix it, right? And that's how they see it. But foreign policy, we have to be careful, is not so important in the grand scheme
yeah,
of things.
yeah,
It will be those pocketbook issues together with immigration and government efficiency. And that's where the Republicans will live or die. If they implement a tariff regime that causes significant inflation, they're in trouble, right? And
yeah.
so those are the key issues that Americans are worried about.
Canada, as you well know, spends most of its time looking south and focusing on the United States. We must. You're our neighbor and our largest trading partner, and all of those obvious things. But as many in this country have said, it's kind of a one-way mirror. Where we look down, we look at every detail, every nuance, and what we see on the other side is, oh yeah, we've got a trade deal with you guys. Yeah, it's not working so well. Yeah, we're going to put some tariffs on that. But then he moves on. Then he's on to China. Then he's on to the UK. Now, over in the Middle East at this point. Is there any? I mean, we've all had individual friends call us and say, oh, we're sorry for what he's doing, calling Canada the 51st state, blah, blah, blah. Is there anything different about Canada because of our proximity and sometimes the familial relations from the other foreign policy questions, quote unquote, that he is dealing with? Do you see any separation there?
I mean, yeah, but obviously, you are different because you're right on the
Yeah,
border, right?
yeah,
And we have a lot of relations, business and otherwise,
yeah,
with Canada. Ultimately, Americans like Canadians a lot. Actually, you like Canadians more based on our last poll more than Brits. So there we go, a few points
yeah,
more, but like it more than Brits. And so you have a lot of soft power here. Um, you know, I you know I can't get into his head necessarily, but I think that ultimately the critical issue for him and for the administration is I think the two borders is less about trade and much more about immigration
And
and drug
security.
trafficking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's about security. Yeah, and it's dealing with the UK on a trade on what the tariff should be is a little bit different than
Yeah.
dealing
It's
with
over
Mexico
there.
or
Yeah.
Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's and we're having this discussion kind of in bits and pieces on this podcast, but I always cast my mind back to 9/11 and Paul Salucci, the ambassador, making it really clear to Canadians here, security trumps trade. It always does. He's going to talk about trade and tariffs and do all of that. But what he cares about is the border, whether we're paying our defense bills and what's going on in the Arctic, right next door to the Russians. Are we doing our job and doing our bit? So I guess do the Americans see it that way? Does the public see it that way, or are we just those friendly guys that live upstairs?
Yeah, I don't think that the average American has clarity about those sorts of
Yeah,
issues, right?
yeah,
But the policy elite obviously do, and the New York and West Coast elites that are business elites do as well. But no, the average American doesn't have insight into those sorts of things. They probably, when they
right,
think of Canada, they think it's cold.
right,
It's
right,
really good at hockey,
right.
and really
We'll
like them because
see. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But not these more specific issues. But definitely when it comes to the administration, they probably are more worried or more focused on the security issues than even the
Yeah.
trade.
Okay. I'm going to come to the Democrats quickly, but I still want to ask a little bit about, how, I don't know how to get at this. I think because I know the economic issue is overpowering. But the high risk nature of his politics, of how he approaches these things, it's poker. He rolls the dice. He puts China up against the wall and sees who blinks first. Or do people are Americans still saying, yeah, that's just how he does business? It's the art of the deal. It's a little risky, or are they getting worried about that, angry about that, disaffected with that approach?
No, it's divided, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we live, obviously in a highly polarized society right now. And so
Yeah.
if you talk to someone from his base, they would go, yeah, he's just using tactics that you know, other politicians would not use. And this is good for America, right? And you talk to Democrats, they'll think he's like using extra institutional means to do things. Maybe he's anti-democratic. He's more authoritarian in the way he does things. He thwarts convention. He's putting everyone at risk, both Americans and people around the world, citizens around the world. So it's not there's no unified view of how he
Yeah.
operates, right? There's a very
Okay.
critical one on the one hand among Democrats, and there's a more positive one relative to his base.
The Democrats seem to be struggling. They've got on the one hand AOC and Bernie out preaching against the oligarchy whilst they fly on their private planes. And Chuck Schumer seems to have had his day. You have people kind of emerging for presidential runs, but nobody's catching on. So what's the issue there is because they have not, we're just going through this to a certain extent, having just had an election too. Like you almost have to do the post-mortem before you can move on. And with Joe Biden reemerging on the scene again and these books about to be unveiled, it's going to be a difficult process.
Yeah, it's going to remain murky, right? But what I would say is that whatever side loses, they're always in disarray. Now,
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes they're more in disarray, and sometimes they're less in disarray. I don't know if we're any worse place with the Democrats than we have been with the Republicans or Democrats in the past, right?
Okay.
And I think what we're seeing is exactly that sort of vacuum, right? And what
But
fills
it's
vacuums?
normal. It's not.
It's
Yeah.
normal, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's normal not just here in the United States, everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And what fills vacuums? Electoral victories.
Yeah.
And what we're going to see in the next little bit of who emerges, right? Who emerges from the state level races that we'll have, who will emerge from the midterm elections that we'll have, who will emerge ultimately from the primaries that we'll have in a few years on the Democratic side. What we do know, structurally speaking, is that this next election doesn't favor the Republicans. It actually favors the Democrats.
Right.
Trump is an incumbent. He's an incumbent that would be stepping aside. Against all sort of all sort of opinions to the contrary that he's going to stay. That just won't happen.
Yeah, no.
And there's no way. He'll have a successor, but successors in situations like that have a pretty low likelihood of winning, at least based upon history, right? Not just history in the United States, but around the world, right? So the Democrats need to have elections to see who emerges. The fact that they're in disarray, I don't think is anything abnormal. I think it's quite normal. I believe that ultimately they're probably favored, just structurally speaking, not even looking at who's going to run in 4 years. The one thing they're worried about, if you talk to them, talk to Democrats and Democratic operatives, they're worried about whether the trends they saw in the last electoral cycle, Black men voting Republican, young men voting Republican, some of these Latinos trending Republican a bit. Will these continue? And I don't think we know.
Yeah.
And what I would say is we shouldn't underestimate the weight of inflation on how people saw the world and how ultimately people voted. Inflation is very, very insidious, especially among the less affluent. And we might be just seeing a momentary impact rather than a long-term one. But again, we don't know. There's a question mark.
We had this conversation with your colleague Daryl post-election, Daryl Bricker, here in Canada, and we've talked about it subsequently, that some of those things, like we have our regional differences here as you do, in the West versus, central Canada, and urban dwellers versus rural dwellers and all those things. But the interesting one is that young base, right? The under 40s who are going more Republican, but mostly the young men, not so much the young women. And I don't know, is it economic? The young women are now way better educated and often making higher incomes, don't need a guy to marry and settle down. They can do that on their own. Like, what are you seeing on your side of the border on those issues?
I think we're seeing the same sort of trend. And by the way, this is a trend that's global, at least in the Western world. It's not just Canada, the United States. I think it goes ultimately to meaning. There's a crisis of meaning. There's a crisis of identity. I think it's existential. I think young men, at least a subset of young men, feel that they've been left behind. Indeed, it feeds into a broader belief system that the system is broken. Is exactly what Trump has sort of channeled in part, right? He's channeling this feeling that the system is broken, channeling this sense that I no longer belong in this system because they're two sides of the same coin. And I think young men are kind of there. They're, for a variety of reasons, they feel they don't have a fair shake,
Right.
And they're reacting to that.
And like policies like DEI, which highlight that, which is, we're going to give everybody but you a shot at this job, right?
And that's an example. And what I would say is that I think the most interesting outcome of 2024, that is the 2024 U.S. presidential election, is not that Trump won. It's that the right was able to consolidate a coalition of sort of libertarians and nationalists. So based, and it's interesting because that sort of consolidation is suggestive of a longer term possibility that they'll have a longer term a coalition. And underlying that is this notion of fundamental freedom and fairness, right? And what happened was they redefined the culture wars. That it's not about DEI. It's about, is it really fair to exclude people or to downweight people? Or it's, we all agree that if you're an adult, you could be whatever you want to be, including transgender. But is it fair for a biological man to compete against a biological woman, as an example? Is it fair? again. And so it's a very interesting sort of trend. It's something that made Trump's coalition more muscular this time. You have that sort of blog sphere with Rogan and others that sort of represent sort of that thread. By the way, none of this was whiteboarded. This grew kind of organically in the ether sphere, let's call it. But it's very powerful. And I think that when you think of young men, in that mix, it makes sense. So they're looking at the world going, is it fair?
Yeah.
Is this fair?
It's not. I mean, I remember reading an interesting piece about education that the assessment by some is even the education system isn't set up for them. Young girls will sit at their desks and do what they're told and take recess, and their notebooks are clean and they color within the lines. And, guys should be having recess 4 times a day because their hormone, everything is different about them. And those are the differences that people have tried to pretend aren't there, whether it's in sport or school or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So now all of a sudden you have emergent constituency
Yeah.
that's demanding something different, even if they don't articulate it as such, right? But I
Yeah.
think that's what we're seeing in part. Now, how big that is, how permanent that is, it's a whole other question. But we're definitely seeing that fissure in American society. And like I said, Ipsos polling globally suggests it's
Is
a global
finding it.
phenomenon. Yeah.
So what does any political party do or any kind of leadership as long as that fissure is also between the male and the female? Because that younger, if you start to see that split, I mean, there's always been some changes in voting. Women seem to care more about social issues and men economic issues, but those are on old fault lines, not the new fault lines where women are very much in the workforce.
I mean, I think ultimately, if you're just thinking of messaging in general, not even about what side you are, I mean, can you create messages and policies, more importantly, that are seen as being fair
Yeah,
and that aren't violating
which comes back to
fairness?
that. Yeah,
And so I think that even more importantly than being fair is not being seen as violating fairness,
yeah,
right? And the Democratic Party ran into a buzzsaw relative to this question, right? Now, I don't think it's permanent. I don't think it's existential. I think parties are rational. They'll figure it out. Elections are super important in sort of recalibrating what
yeah.
the the zeitgeist of a given thing like a party. But it definitely is a problem. And just going back to your initial question about Democrats, I don't think they have this figured out, right?
Yeah.
They're still stuck on this whole Donald Trump's an authoritarian, mantra, excuse me.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's not where people are. Yeah, maybe some of your bases and people don't like the thwarting of convention or norms, but they have a lot of other issues that are more fundamental to them, including issues of feeling like they have a fair shake in society. And I was just going to say, so like just going to that specific point, I think the Democrats would be much more effective if they made and obviously Elon Musk has kind of stepped out,
Yeah.
after a little bit, but like how easy would it have been just to say, look at that billionaire, he's taking your stuff away.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
an issue of fundamental fairness. Is we have a huge debt, but is it fair for us to cut our stuff, have our stuff cut when the super rich are not paying their fair share now? They
No,
would
that's
argue
what
that
I
they
mean.
are,
There's
but the Democrats are I feel we've begun to see that happen with the
okay.
Bernies of the world, right? But it's
Yeah.
still they're not quite there.
Yeah.
But I think elections will get them there.
And the counter argument too that the Republicans have is that the authoritarianism isn't exclusive to the right; it's also on the left. The limiting of free speech, the all of the rules and roles that they want governments and decision makers to play in your own personal life.
Yeah, I mean, like especially social media, thinking of social
Right.
media platforms
Right.
and limiting, one person's misinformation is another person's free speech. So,
Exactly.
no, without a doubt. And so it goes both ways. And no one owns fairness. No one owns freedom.
Right.
By the way,
Right.
those are fundamental values that, or foundational values, excuse me, that we all hold, right?
Right.
And what we know based upon scientific research is that they're precognitive in nature. They're hardwired in humans, and
Yeah.
um, so that means that if you're talking about fairness, people will listen. They'll be, but if you violate it, they'll have a innate reaction to it, right? And I think both sides of the aisle have to understand that any sort of policies or a set of policies or agenda they push forward has to consider that.
Okay, that's a really interesting point because then I want your perspective, which probably has nothing to do with polling per se, but some things that are you just look at the Biden redemption tour. Okay, who thought that was a good idea? And then the role of the media who and some people on the right have called this a huge constitutional crisis that there was a guy in office that may or may not been functioning as president, and somebody should be held answerable for that, including the media who covered it up. So now all these things are happening at once. He's back with the redemption tour. It wasn't, they were mean to me. And the journalists are switching sides now, writing books and making money. Like, how is that going to play into this instinctive kind of quest for fairness?
I think it's going to be a fast burn. I
Okay.
think we're going to go through this iteration a bit. I mean, does it last longer than September? I doubt it.
Okay.
The
So,
more important issues are whether we have inflation or not, which I don't think we're going to have
right.
super high inflation based upon all the economic forecasts. But like that's something that Americans will be more focused on. This is all Beltway banter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The same
and
with the plane. I have to ask about the planes. So the president is off to Saudi Arabia. Even his trip to the Middle East and his relationship with the Qataris, that's a trouble spot inside MAGA, inside the right side of the spectrum, because all the ties to 9/11, whatever. There's a whole list of things there. Then he's going to take a free plane and in doesn't matter whether it goes to the Defense Department. Like, again, are these just stuff inside the Beltway and people are going, I don't know if he needs a new plane, let him have a new plane.
listen, like it's not a good look.
Right.
Like Biden's tour is not a good look, but
Yeah.
I think that I think that Main Street America was worried about other things.
Other stuff.
This
Right.
is like just this isn't central. This is Beltway chatter. Basically, the elites are talking about it. Whether it's right or wrong, let's set that aside for a
Yeah.
second. It's not
Yeah.
that big.
So what does if Trump uses this tariff issue. So the Chinese there's mixed reviews on this, but essentially the tariffs are way back down. So he can argue they blinked. He put them so high that they just said, okay, uncle, we'll do this, call these off for 90 days and we'll start talking. Um, he may get Putin to the table in this war. He's he's issued the threat to Iran. You stand down or we're going to blast you off the face of the earth. There's enough stuff there that he can declare a win. I mean, he does it anyway, as you say. He declares things winnable. Like, how much time does he have to get some check marks beside those big issues whilst the economy kind of turns around underneath people?
Yeah, it really depends on how much he backs off on the tariffs, right?
Yeah.
And because, but um, I would say he has through a big chunk of this year, maybe not all the way through it
Okay.
to kind of survive that way. I said before that I think a lot of his decline was friction. If he's
Yeah.
not sort of bumping up against stuff so much, he might gain a few points there. I don't know if these foreign policy victories are going to have such a great impact. I mean, they're not going to hurt him.
Right.
So they're net neutral to a little bit positive, but they don't. Again, I'm thinking about how they impact approval ratings, and
Right.
they're not shown to be very important in the grand scheme of things. It will be the economy. It will be the ultimate impact of unemployment on the one hand and inflation on the other. And all the forecasts right now, which assume about 10% a 10% tariff,
Right.
has some sort of economic decline, but no recession. And what we know about unemployment and inflation as sort of economic variables that have impact on approval ratings, they're non-linear, meaning you got to get to a certain level, right, before they have an impact. And so we know
Right.
with unemployment, you got to get to 7% unemployment to really have an impact on approval ratings. And you need to get to about 5.6% for inflation. That's not to say if you get into the threes, there might not you might not lose a point here or there. But the point is, I actually think he gets through this year fairly okay.
Hmm.
I don't think that at the very least there won't. Our base case is that I don't think he is going to implode unless something else happens. So basically, tariff light has a couple foreign policy victories. I think he's probably in a pretty good place relative to his approval ratings.
So that's the issue there. Those foreign policy questions, not determinative, but better a win than a loss because then they've just
Yeah.
got that notion that he's succeeding.
Yeah,
And in
because it might
fact,
it might play at a different level, by the way. Just like it might not
yeah,
be public opinion. He might like, among like, Wall Street with Wall Street or, brick and mortar CEOs, you might it might give you sort of a little bit more currency to navigate those stakeholders than you would otherwise have. So it's not to say it's not important. It's just not going to
yeah.
play probably at a public opinion level.
But the deal with China, we saw the stock market rebound like
Oh yeah,
instantly.
they
So
love it.
everybody's 401ks feel better. And so if you have a couple of those, it starts to counter. Or if he comes back from the Middle East with $1 trillion worth of investment and somebody sees a plant, or the factories from Canada move back across the border to stay on the other side of the tariff wall, those become jobs.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And again, I think what we're saying, just, in general, is that it's not so bad. It's not so good. It's somewhere in between. And
Yeah,
it's probably more positive than negative
yeah.
for him, right?
Yeah. And then the midterms start to change the game because then it's back into political warfare.
Yeah. Yeah. Going into next year, right? And so
Yeah.
November, December, that's when it starts.
Are you
But
surprised yourself, just as somebody, I mean, you've lived in other parts in the world, but as an American living through this, and all of the predictions that the world as we know it was going to end, and some people still really truly believe that. Like, are you surprised at how, I don't know, underneath all the activity and chaos, stuff's getting done? There is kind of a move forward in some way. I don't know. I don't want to try not to be pejorative, but everything's moving forward economically speaking. Government is running, there's the borders are more secure, that everybody just kind of feels like, okay, somebody's in charge here.
no, I'm not. I'm not surprised. I think that there was a over rotation, overreaction to what was going on. By the way, living in other places that are much more complicated than this place,
Right.
that is the United States, you would see the same sort of thing, like a lot of markets overreacting
Yeah.
to new political actors, or or political executives, chief executives taking over, but ultimately being sort of reasonably sort of moderating what they're doing. I'm not saying he is reasonably moderated; he's taking a different tack. But we're also, I think, we always have to remember, we're a country of 330 million people.
Hmm.
If you think of it like this, we have something like 15 Londons here, meaning
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
extremely decentralized economically. We have elites all over the place. We have businesses
Right.
all over the place, right? And we're a federated system. And so, no, I'm not surprised.
What, if anything, surprised you in the 100 days plus since he took the oath?
Yeah, so I've stated this, like my working thesis has always been that public opinion would be the guardrail. or a
Hmm.
critical guardrail. And so it would set the parameters by which he would operate. I was questioning myself for a while whether that was the case. But I think that what we're seeing now with this sort of partial step back from a very aggressive tariff regime, we're seeing that, and it's interesting. And when you talk to Americans, by the way, they don't like tariffs. You say tariffs, they don't like it. They think of inflation. They link the two together, but they still think that the world's taking advantage of America.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's this
Yeah.
kind of fundamental fairness issue. So like if we pay so much, we pay 20% with country Y,
And they
and they
only
pay
pay 10.
zero, like
Yeah.
why shouldn't it just both be 10? Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
which is not an unreasonable question. And so
Right.
like at a
Absolutely.
certain level, I mean, when we think of, let's call it America First agenda or Freedom First agenda, right? Part of it is stepping back from the world and finding a new equilibrium point when it comes to the United States inserted into the geopolitical system. And maybe sometimes that's painful, but that's in part what we're seeing, right? There's a questioning, at least in America, about whether we should pay the burden. We should take the burden, as we always have, at least since World War II. Again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's a very much a thread of and rationale here in America.
It's really interesting. The whole question of fairness and how people are defining that through their own experience, I think I mean, it just has such huge implications. Great to talk to you, Cliff. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Yeah, we just wanted this little look back in because, through our election, of course, he claimed credit for electing Mark Carney and all of those
And we
things.
probably helped indirectly. I think
Oh,
that,
no, you definitely
oh,
made
he
that
totally
happen.
changed the scenario. It's a fascinating case study, by the way.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's galvanized us again, as a country to look about. And I'm hoping that it has also made us look in that mirror. And because the stuff he says you have to listen to, you're not paying your bills. Your border is porous.
But it is true in many cases. And so it's just
Exactly.
like,
That's the point.
and so have
Yeah.
we, yeah, exactly. And the question is, have we really been reflecting? And so
Yeah.
do you need a disruptor sometimes to
Yeah.
reflect?
Yeah. Exactly right. Okay, great to talk to you. Cliff Young, president of Polling and Societal Trends, which we have indeed been talking about at Ipsos, based in Washington. We'll talk soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll talk to you soon, too.